King James VI of Scotland / King James I of England. Demonology, in Modern English 1597. The Preface to the Reader. The fearful abundance at this time in this country, of these detestable slaves of the devil, the witches or enchanters, hath moved me, beloved reader, to dispatch and post this following treatise of mine, not in any way, as I protest, to serve for a show of my learning and ingenious, but only, moved of conscience, to press thereby, so far as I can, to resolve the doubting hearts of many, both that such assaults of Satan are most certainly practiced, and that the instruments thereof merits most severely to be punished, against the damnable opinions of two principally in our age, whereof the one called Scot an Englishman, is not ashamed in public print to deny, that there can be such things as witchcraft, and so maintains the old error of the Sadducees, in denying of spirits. The other called Wierus, a German physician, sets out a public apology for all these craftsfolks, whereby, procuring for their impunity, he plainly betrays himself to have been one of that profession. And for to make this treatise the more pleasant and easy, I have put it in form of dialogue, which I have divided into 3 books, the first speaking of magic in general, and necromancy in special, the second of sorcery and witchcraft, and the third contains a discourse of all these kinds of spirits and spectres that appears and troubles persons, together with a conclusion of the whole work. My intention in this labor is only to prove 2 things, as I have already said, the one, that such devilish arts have been and are. The other, what exact trial and severe punishment they merit, and therefore reason, what kind of things are possible to be performed in these arts, and by what natural causes they may be, not that I touch every particular thing of the devil's power, for that were infinite, but only to speak scholastically, since this cannot be spoken in our language, I reason upon the kind, genus, leaving appearance, species, and differences, differentia, to be comprehended therein. As for example, speaking of the power of magicians, in the 1st book and 6th chapter, I say that they can suddenly be brought unto them, all kinds of dainty dishes, by their familiar spirit, since as a thief he delights to steal, and as a spirit he can subtly and suddenly enough transport the same. Now under this kind, genus, may be comprehended all particulars, depending thereupon, such as the bringing wine out of the wall, as we have heard of to have been practiced, and such others, which particulars are sufficiently proven by the reasons of the general, and such like in the 2nd book of witchcraft in special, and 5th chapter. I say and prove by diverse arguments that witches can, by the power of their master, cure or cast on diseases, now by these same reasons, that proves their power by the devil of diseases in general, is as well proven by their power in special, as of weakening the nature of some men, to make them unable for women, and making it to abound in others, more than the ordinary course of nature would permit. And such like in all other particular sicknesses, but one thing I will pray thee to observe in all these places, where I reason upon the devil's power, which is the different ends and scopes that God is the first cause, and the devil as his instrument, and second cause shoots at in all these actions of the devil, as God's hangman. For where the devil's intention in them is ever to perish, either the soul, or the body, or both of them, that he is so permitted to deal with, God by the contrary draws ever out of the evil glory to himself, either by the wrath of the wicked in his justice, or by the trial of the patient, and amendment of the faithful, being wakened up with that rod of correction. Having thus declared unto thee then, my full intention in this treatise, thou wilt easily excuse, I doubt not, as well my predetermining, to declare the whole particular rites and secrets of these unlawful arts, as also their infinite and wonderful practices, as being neither of them pertinent to my purpose, the reason whereof is given in the hinder end of the 1st chapter of the 3rd book, and who likes to be curious in these things, he may read, if he will hear of their practices, botanus, demonology, collected with greater diligence, then written with judgment, together with their confessions that have been at this time apprehended. If he would know what hath been the opinion of the ancients, concerning their power, he shall see it well described by Hyperius and Hemingiu, two late German writers, besides innumerable other noteworthy theologists. That writes largely upon that subject, and if he would know what are the particular rites and curiosities of these black arts, which is both unnecessary and perilous, he will find it in the 4th book of Cornelius Agrippa, and in Wierus, whom of I speak. And so wishing my pains in this treatise, beloved reader, to be effectual in arming all them that reads the same, against these above-mentioned errors, and recommending my goodwill to thy friendly acceptation, I bid thee hearty farewell. James R.X. Demonology, in form of a dialogue, 1st book argument, the exhort of the whole, the description of magic in special. Chapter 1. Proven by Scripture that these unlawful arts of this sort, in general, have been, and may be put into practice. Philomaths and Epistemon reason the matter. Phi, I am surely very glad to have met with you this day, for I am of opinion, that ye can better resolve me of something, whereof I stand in great doubt, nor any other whom with I could have met. Api, in what I can, that ye like to ask at me I will willingly and freely tell my opinion, and if I prove it not sufficiently, I am heartily content that a better reason carry it away then. Phi, what think ye of these strange news, which now only furnishes purpose to all men at their meeting, I mean of these witches? Api, surely they are wonderful, and I think so clear and plain confessions in that purpose, have never fallen out in any age or country. Phi, no question if they be true, but thereof the doctor doubts. Api, what part of it doubt ye of? Phi, even of all, for aught I can yet perceive, and namely, that there is such thing as witchcraft or witches, and I would pray to you to resolve me thereof if ye may, for I have reasoned with sundry in that matter, and yet could never be satisfied therein. Api, I shall with good will do the best I can, but I think it the difficulter, since ye deny the thing itself in general, for as it is said in the logic schools, do not try to prove a negative, contra negantem principia non est disputandum. Always for that part, that witchcraft and witches have been, and are, the former part is clearly proven by the Scriptures, and the last by daily experience and confessions. Phi, I know ye will allege me Saul's Pythia, but that as appears will not make much for you. Api, not only that place, but divers others, but I marvel why that should not make much for me. Phi, the reasons are these. First ye may consider that Saul being troubled in spirit, and having fasted long before, as the text testifies, and being, Sam 28. 2. Come to a woman that was brute to have such knowledge, and that to inquire so important news, he having so guilty a conscience for his heinous offenses, and specially, for that same unlawful curiosity, and horrible defection, and then the woman crying out upon the sudden in great admiration for the uncouth sight that she alleged to have seen discovering him to be the king, though disguised, and denied by him before, it was no wonder I say, that his sense being this distracted, he could not perceive her fawning of her voice, he being himself in another chamber, and seeing nothing. Next what could be, or was raised? The spirit of Samuel? Profane and against all theology, the devil in his likeness? As unapparent, that either God would permit him to come in the shape of his saints, for then could never the prophets in those days have been sure what spirit spoke to them in their visions, or then that he could foretell what was to come thereafter, for prophecy proceeds only of God. And the devil hath no knowledge of things to come. Api, yet if ye will mark the words of the text, ye will find clearly that Saul saw that apparition. forgiving you that Saul was in another chamber at the making of the circles, and conjurations needful for that purpose, as none of that craft will permit any others to behold at that time, yet it is evident by the text that howsome that once that unclean spirit was fully risen. She called in upon Saul. For it is said in the text that Saul knew him to be Samuel, which could not have been by the hearing tell only of an old man with a mantilla, since there was many more old men dead in Israel nor Samuel, and the common weed of that whole country was mantillas. As to the next, that it was not the spirit of Samuel, I grant, in the proving whereof ye need not to insist, since all Christians of whatsoever religion agree upon that, and none other but mere ignorance or necromancers or witches doubts thereof. And that the devil is permitted at sometimes to put himself in the likeness of the saints, it is plain in the scriptures where it is said that, cor. 11. 14. Satan can transform himself into an angel of light. Neither could that bring any inconvenient with the visions of the prophets, since it is most certain that God will not permit him so to deceive his own, but only such as wilfully deceives themselves by running unto him, whom God then suffers to fall in their own snares, and justly permits them to be deluded with great efficacy of deceit, because they would not believe the truth, as Paul said. And as to the devil's foretelling of things to come, it is true that he knows not all things future, but yet that he knows part. The tragical event of this histories declares it, which the wit of woman could never have forspoken, not that he hath any presence, which is only proper to God, or yet knows anything by looking upon God, as in a mirror, as the good angels do, he being forever debarred from the favorable presence and countenance of his Creator, but only one of these two means, either as being worldly wise, and taught by a continual experience, ever since creation, judges by likelihood of things to come, according to the like that had passed before, and the natural causes in respect of the vicissitude of all things wordy, or else by God's employing of him in turn, and so foreseen thereof, as appears to have been in this, whereof we find the very like in Micheas's prophetic discourse to King Ahab. But to prove this, my first proposition, that there, 1 Kings 22, can be such a thing as witchcraft and witches, there are many more places in the scriptures than this, as I said before. As first in the law of God, it is, Exodus 22, plainly prohibited, but certain it is, that the law of God speaks nothing in vain, neither doth it lay curses, or enjoin punishments upon shadows, condemning that to be ill, which is not in essence, or being as we call it. Secondly, it is plain where wicked Pharaoh's wise men imitated a number of Moses' miracles, Exodus and Isam 15, to harden the tyrant's heart thereby. Thirdly, said not Samuel to Saul that disobedience is as the sin of witchcraft? To compare a thing that were it not, it were too absurd. Fourthly, was not Simon Magus a man of that craft? And fifthly, what was she that had the spirit, Acts 8 and 10, of Pythia? Besides innumerable other places that were too irksome to recite. Chapter 2. What kind of sin the practitioners of these unlawful arts commit. The division of these arts, and what are the means that allure any to practice them. But I think it very strange that God should permit any mankind, since they bear his own image, to fall in so gross and filthy a defection. Although man in his creation was made to the image of the Creator, yet, Gen. 1, through his fall having once lost it, it is but restored again in part by grace only to the elect. So all the rest falling away from God are given over in the hands of the devil that enemy, to bear his image, and being once so given over, the greatest and the grossest impiety, is the pleasantest and most delightful unto them. But it may not suffice him to have indirectly the rule, and procure the perdition of so many souls by alluring them to vices, and to the following of their own appetites, suppose he not abuse so many souls, in making them directly acknowledge him for their master? AP. No surely, for he uses every man whom he hath the rule, according to their complexion and knowledge. And so whom he finds most simple, he plainly discovers himself unto them, for he being the enemy of man's salvation, uses all the means he can to entrap them so far in his snares, as it may be unable to them thereafter, suppose they would, to rid themselves of the same. Fie, then this sin is a sin against the Holy Ghost. AP. It is in some, but not in all. Fie, how's that? Are not all these that run directly to the devil in one category? AP. God forbid, for the sin against the Holy Ghost hath two branches. The one, a falling back from the whole service of God, and a refusal of all his precepts. The other is the doing of the first with knowledge, knowing that they do wrong against their own conscience, and the testimony of the Holy Spirit, having once had a taste of that sweetness of God's mercies. Now in Neheb 6. 10. First of these two, all sorts of necromancers, enchanters or witches are comprehended, but in the last, none but such as heirs with this knowledge that I have spoken of. Fie, then it appears that there are more sorts nor one that are directly professors of his service, and if so be, I pray you tell me how many, and what are they? AP. There are principally two sorts whereunto all the parties of that unhappy art are redacted, whereof one is called magic or necromancy, the other sorcery, or witchcraft. Fie, what I pray you? And how many are the names whereby the devil allures persons in any of these snares? AP. Even by these three passions that are within ourselves. Curiosity in great imaginings, thrift of revenge for some torts deeply apprehended, or greedy appetite of gear caused through great poverty. As to the first of these, curiosity, it is only the enticement of magicians or necromancers, and the other two are the allures of the sorcerers or witches, for that old and crafty serpent, being a spirit, he easily pays our affections, and so conforms himself thereto, do deceive us to our wrath. Chapter 3. The significance and etymology of the words of magic and necromancy, the difference betwixt necromancy and witchcraft. What are the entries and beginnings that bring any to the knowledge thereof? Fie, I would gladly first hear what thing it is that ye call magic or necromancy. AP. This word magic in the Persian tongue imports as much as to be any contemplator, or interpreter of divine and heavenly sciences, which first being used amongst the Chaldeans through their ignorance of the true divinity, was esteemed and reputed amongst them as a principal virtue. And therefore, was named unjustly with an honorable style, which name the Greeks imitated, generally importing these kinds of unlawful arts. And this word necromancy is a Greek word, compounded of nekron and mantia, which is to say the prophecy by the dead. This last name is given to this black and unlawful science by the figure synecdoche, because it is a principal part of that art to serve themselves with dead carcasses in their divinations. This last name is given to this black and unlawful science by the figure synecdoche, because it is a principal part of that art to serve themselves with dead carcasses in their divinations. Fie, what difference is there betwixt this art and witchcraft? AP. Surely, the difference vulgarly put betwixt them is very merry, and in a manner true, for they say that the witches are servants only, and slaves to the devil, but the necromancers are his masters and commanders. Fie, how can that be true? Any men being specially addicted to this service can be his commanders? AP. Yeah, they may be, but it is only secondary, secundum quid, for it is not by any power that they can have over him, but only as he grants it, ex pacto, only, whereby he obliges himself in some trifles to them, that he may on the other part obtain the fruition of their body and soul, which is the only thing he hunts for. Fie, a very inequitable contract forsooth. But I pray you discourse unto me, what is the effect and secrets of that art? Apy, that is over large a field ye give me, yea I shall do good will, the most summarily that I can to run through the principal points thereof. As there are two sorts of folks that may be enticed to this art, to wit, learned or unlearned, so there is two means which are the first stirrers up and feeders of their curiosity, thereby to make them to give themselves over to the same, which by two means I call Devil's school, and his rudiments. The learned have their curiosities weakened upon and fed by that which I call his school. This is the astrology judiciary. For diverse men having attained to a great perfection learning, and yet remaining overbear, alas, of the spirit of regeneration, and fruits thereof, finding all natural things common, as well to the stupid pedants as unto them. They essay to vindicate unto them a greater name by not only knowing the course of things heavenly, but likewise to climb to the knowledge of things to come thereby. Which, at the first face appearing lawful unto them, in respect the ground thereof seems to proceed of natural causes only, they are so allured thereby that finding their practice to prove true in sundry things, they study to know the cause thereof, and so mounting from degree to degree, upon the slippery and uncertain scale of curiosity, they are at last enticed that where lawful arts of science fails to satisfy their restless minds, even to seek to that black and unlawful science of magic, where, finding at the first that such diverse forms of circles and conjurations rightly joined thereunto will raise such diverse forms of spirits, to resolve them of their doubts, and attributing the doing thereof to the power inseparably tied, or inherent in the circles, and many words of God confusedly wrapped in it, they blindly glory of themselves, as if they and by their quickness of ingenious made a conquest of Pluto's dominion, and were become emperors over the Stygian dwellings, where, in the meantime, miserable wretches, they are become in very deed, bond slaves to their mortal enemy, and their knowledge for all they presume thereof, is nothing increased, except in knowing evil and the horrors of hell for punishment thereof, as Adam was by the eating of the forbidden tree. Gen. 3. Chapter 4. The description of the rudiments in school, which are the entries to the art of magic, and in special, the differences between astronomy and astrology, division of astrology in diverse parts. Fie, but I pray you likewise forget not to tell what are the devil's rudiments. Apy, his rudiments, I call first in general all that which is called vulgarly the virtue of words, herb, and stone, which is used by unlawful charms without natural causes. As likewise all kind of practices, freights, or other like extraordinary actions which cannot abide the true touch of natural reason. Fie, I would have you to make that plainer by some particular examples, for your proposition is very general. Apy, I mean either by such kinds of charms as commonly daft wives use, for healing of forspoken goods, for preserving them from evil eyes, by knitting round trees, or sundry kind of herbs, or the hair or tails of the goods, by curing the worm, by stemming of blood, by healing of horsecrooks, by turning of the riddle, or doing such like innumerable things by words, without applying anything meet to the part offended, as medicine or stew. Or else by staying married folks to have natural ado with each other, by knitting so many knots upon a point at the time of their marriage, and such like things which men use to practice in their merriness. For from unlearned men, being naturally curious and lacking the true knowledge of God, find these practices to prove true, as sundry of them will do by the power of the devil for deceiving men, and not by any inherent virtue in these vain words and freights. And being desirous to win a reputation to themselves in such like turns, they either, if they be of the bashful sort, seek to be learned by some that are experimented in that art, not knowing it to be evil at the first, or else being of the grosser sort. Run directly to the devil for ambition of desire of gain, and plainly contract with him thereupon. Fie, but methinks these means which ye call the school, and rudiments of the devil are things lawful, and have been approved for such in all times and ages. As in special, this science of astrology, which is one of the special members of mathematics. AP, there are two things which the learned have observed from the beginning, in the science of the heavenly creatures, the planets, stars, and such like. The one is their course and ordinary motions, which for that cause is called astronomy, which word is a compound of nomos and asteron, that is to say, the law of the stars. And this art is indeed one of the members of the mathematics, and not only lawful, but most necessary and commendable. The other is called astrology, being compounded of asteron and logos, which is to say, the word and preaching of the stars, which is divided in two parts. The first by knowing thereby the powers of simples and sicknesses, the course of the seasons, and whether being ruled by their influence, which part depending upon the former, although it be not of itself a part of mathematics, yet it is not unlawful, being moderately used. Suppose not so necessary and commendable as the former. The second part is to trust so much to their influences, as thereby to foretell what commonwealths shall flourish or decay, what persons shall be fortunate or unfortunate, what side shall win in any battle, what man shall obtain victories at singular combat, what way and of what age men shall die, what horse shall win at match running, and divers others have more curiously than profitably written at large. Of this root last spoken of springs innumerable branches, such as the knowledge by the nativities, the chiromancy, geomancy, hydromancy, arithmancy, physiognomy, and 1,000 others which were much practiced and held in great reverence by the Gentiles of old. And this last part of astrology whereof I have spoken, which is the root of their branches, was called by them pars fortunae. This part is now utterly unlawful to be trusted in or practiced amongst Christians, as leaning to no ground of natural reason, and it is this part, which I called before the devil's school. Fie, but yet many of the learned are of the contrary opinion. AP, I grant, yet I could give my reasons to fortify and maintain my opinion. If to enter into this disputation, it would not draw me quite off the ground of our discourse, besides the misspending of the whole day thereupon. One word only I will answer to them, and that in the Scriptures, which must be an infallible true ground to all true Christians, that in the prophet Jeremiah it is plainly forbidden to believe or hearken unto them that prophesies and foretells by the course of the planets and stars. Ja. 10. Chapter 5. How far the using of charms is lawful or unlawful. The description of the forms of circles and conjurations, and what causes the magicians themselves to weary thereof. Fie, well, ye have said far enough in that argument. But how prove ye now that these charms or unnatural practices are unlawful? For so many honest and merry men and women have publicly practiced some of them, that I think if ye would accuse them all of witchcraft, ye would affirm more nor ye will be believed in. AP, I see if ye had taken good tent to the nature of that word, whereby I named it, ye would not have been in this doubt, nor mistaken me so far as ye have done. For although as none can be scholars in a school, and not be subject to the master thereof, so none can study, and put in practice, for study the alone, and knowledge, is more perilous nor offensive. And it is the practice only that makes the greatness of the offense, the circles and art of magic without committing a horrible defection from God. And yet as they that read and learn their rudiments, are not the more subject to any schoolmaster if it pleases not their parents to put them to the school thereafter, so they who ignorantly proves these practices, which I call the devil's rudiments, unknowing them to be baits cast out by him for trapping such as God will permit to fall in his hands. This kind of folks, I say, no doubt, are to be judged the best of, in respect they use no invocation nor help him, by their knowledge at least, in these turns, and so have never entered themselves in Satan's service. Yet to speak truly for my own part, I speak, but only for myself, I desire not to make so near writing. For in my opinion our enemy is over-crafty, and we over-weak, except the greater grace of God, to essay such hazards, wherein he presses to trap us. Fie, ye have reason forsooth, for as the common proverb says, they that eat soup with the devil have need of long spoons. But now I pray you go forward in the describing of this art of magic. 8b. From they become once unto this perfection in evil and having any knowledge, whether learned or unlearned, of this black art, they then begin to be weary of the raising of their master, by conjured circles, being both so difficult and perilous, and so come plainly to a contract with him, wherein is specially contained forms and effects. Fie, but I pray you or ever you go further, discourse with me somewhat of their circles and conjurations, and what should be the case of their wearying thereof. For it should seem that that form should be less fearful yet than the direct haunting and society with that foul and unclean spirit. 8b. I think ye take me to be a witch myself, or at the least would gladly swear yourself apprentice to that craft. Always as I may, I shall shortly satisfy you in that kind of conjurations which are contained in such books, which I call the Devil's School. There are 4 principal parts, the persons of the conjurations, which are contained in such books which I call the Devil's School. There are 4 principal parties, the persons of the conjurers, the action of the conjuration, the words and rides used to that effect, and the spirits that are conjured. Ye must first remember to lay the ground that I told you before, which is, that it is no power inherent in the circles, or in the holiness of the names of God blasphemously used, nor in whatsoever rites or ceremonies at that time used that either can raise any infernal spirit, or yet limit him by force within or without these circles. For it is he only, the father of all lies, who having first of all prescribed that form of doing, feigning himself to be commanded and restrained thereby, will be loath to pass the bounds of these injunctions, as well thereby to make them glory in the umpiring over him, as I said before, as likewise to make himself so to be trusted in these little things that he may have the better commodity thereafter, to deceive them in the end with a trick, once and for all. I mean the everlasting perdition of their soul and body. Then laying this ground, as I have said, these conjurations must have a few or more in number of the persons conjurers, always passing the singular number, according to the quality of the circle and form of apparition. 2 principal things cannot well in that errand be wanted, holy water, whereby the devil mocks the papistry, and some present of a living thing unto him. There are likewise certain seasons, days, and hours that they observe in this purpose. These things being all ready and prepared, circles are made triangular, quadrangular, round, double or single, according to the form of apparition that they crave. But to speak of the diverse forms of the circles, of the innumerable characters and crosses that are within, and without, and out through the same of the diverse forms of apparitions that crafty spirit eludes them with, and of all such particulars in that action, I remit it to over many that have busied their heads in describing of the same, as being but curious and altogether unprofitable. And this far only I touch, that when the conjured spirit appears, which will not be while after many circumstances, long prayers, and much muttering and murmuring of the conjurers, like a papist priest dispatching a hunting mass. How soon I say he appears if they have missed one iota of their rites, or if any of their feet once slide over the circle through terror of his fearful apparition, he pays himself at that time in his own hand, of that due debt which they ought him, and otherwise would have delayed longer to have paid him. I mean he carries them with body and soul. If this be not now a just cause to make them weary of these forms of conjuration, I leave it to you to judge upon, considering the duration of the labor, the precise keeping of days and hours, as I have said, the terribleness of the apparition, and the present peril that they stand in missing the least circumstance or freight that they ought to observe. And on the other part, the devil is glad to move them to a plain and square dealing with him, as I said before. Chapter 6. The devil's contract with the magicians. The division thereof in two parts. What is the difference betwixt God's miracles and the devil's? Fie, indeed there is cause enough, but rather the leave him at all than to run more plainly to him, if they were wise he dealt with. But go forward now, I pray you, to these turns, for they become once deacons in this craft. From time that they once plainly begin to contract with him, the effect of their contract consists in two things, in forms and effects, as I began to tell already, were it not ye interrupted me, for although the contract be mutual, I speak of that first part, wherein the devil presents himself to them, by forms. I mean in what shape or fashion he shall come unto them, when they call upon him. And by effects, I understand in what special sorts of services he binds himself to be subject unto them. The quality of these forms and effects is less or greater, according to the skill and art of the magician. For as to the forms, to some of the baser sort of them he presents himself to appear at their calling upon him by such a proper name which he shows unto them, either in likeness of a dog, a cat, and ape, or such like other beast, or else to answer by a voice only. The effects are to answer to such demands as concerns curing of diseases, their own particular menagerie, or such other base things as they require of him. But to the most curious sort, in the forms he will present himself, to enter in a dead body, and thereout of to give such answers of the events of battles, of matters concerning the estate of commonwealths, and such like other great questions. Yet to some he will be a continual attender in form of a page. He will permit himself to be conjured for the space of so many years, either in a tablet or ring, or such like thing which they may easily carry about with them. He gives them power to sell such wares to others, whereof some will be dearer, and some better cheap, according to the lying or true speaking of the spirit that is conjured therein. Not but in very deed, all devils must be liars, but so they abuse the simplicity of these wretches that become their scholars, that they make them believe that at the fall of Lucifer, some spirits fell in the air, some in the fire, some in the water, some in the land, in which elements they still remain. Whereupon they build that such as fell in the fire, or in the air, are truer than they who fell in the water, or in the land, which is all but mere prattle, and forged to be the author of all deceit. For the fall not be weight, as solid substance to stick in any one part, but the principle of their fall, consisting in quality by the falling from the grace of God wherein they were created, they continued still thereafter, and shall do while the latter day. In wandering through the world as God's hangman, to execute such turns as he employs in them. And when any of them are not occupied in that, return they must to their prison in hell, as it is plainly in the miracle that Christ wrought at Gennesareth, Matt. 8. Therein at the latter day to be enclosed forever, and as they deceive their scholars in this, so do they in imprinting in them the opinion that there are so many princes, dukes, and kings amongst them, every one commanding fewer or more legions, and dominating in diverse arts and quarters of the earth. For though that I will not deny that there be a form of order amongst the angels in heaven, and consequentially was amongst them before their fall, yet either that they broke the same sense, or that God will permit us to know by damned devils, such heavenly mysteries of his which he would not reveal to us either by scripture no prophets, I think no Christian will once think it. But by the contrary of all such mysteries contented with a humble ignorance, they being things not necessary for our salvation. But to return to the purpose, as these forms wherein Satan presents himself to the greatest of the magicians, are wonderfully curious, so are the effects correspondent unto the same. For he will present himself to teach them arts and sciences, which he may easily do, being so learned a knave as he is. To carry them news from any part of the world, which the agility of a spirit may easily perform to reveal to them the secrets of any person, so being they be once spoken, for the thought none knows but God, except so far as ye may guess by their countenance. As one who is doubtlessly learned enough in the physiognomy. Yet he will make his scholars to creep in credit with princes by foretelling them many great things, part true, part false, for if all were false he would lose credit at all handles, but always doubtful, as his oracles were. And he will also make them to please princes by fair banquets and dainty dishes, carried in short space from the farthest part of the world. For no man doubts but he is a thief, and his agility, as I spoke before, makes him to come at such speed. Such like, he will guard his scholars with fair armies of horsemen and footmen in appearance, castles and forts, which are all but impressions in the air, easily gathered by a spirit, drawing so near to that substance himself. As in like manner, he will learn them many jugglery tricks at cards, dice, and such like to deceive men's senses thereby, and such innumerable false practices, which are proven by over many in this age, as they who are acquainted with that Italian called Scoto yet living, can report. And yet are all these things but deluding of the senses, and no way true in substance, as were the false miracles wrought by King Pharaoh's magicians for counterfeiting Moses. For that is the difference betwixt God's miracles, and the devil's God as a creator. What he makes appear in miracle, it is so in effect. As Moses' rod being cast down, was no doubt turned in a natural serpent, whereas the devil, as God's ape, counterfeiting that by common proof, that simple tricksters will make 100 things seem both to our eyes and ears otherwise than what they are. Now as to the magician's part of the contact, it is in a word that thing, which I said before, the devil hunts for in all men. Fie, surely ye have said much to me in this art, if all that you have said be as true as wonderful. Ape, for the truth in these actions, it will be easily confirmed to any that pleases to take pain upon the reading of diverse authentic histories, and the inquiring of daily experience. And as for the truth of the possibility that they may be, and in what manner, I trust one have alleged nothing whereunto I have not joined such probable reasons, as I leave to your discretion to weigh and consider. One word only I omitted, concerning the form of making of this contract, which is either written with the magician's own blood, or else being agreed upon, in terms his schoolmaster, touches him in some part, though perhaps no mark remains, as it doth will all witches. Chapter 7. The reason why the art of magic is unlawful, what punishment they merit, and who may be accounted guilty of that crime. Fie, surely ye have made this art to appear very monstrous and detestable. But what I pray you shall be said to such as maintains this art to be lawful, for as evil you have made it. Ape, I say they favor of the art themselves, or at least little better. And yet I would be glad to hear their reasons. Fie, there are two principally that ever I heard used, beside that which is founded upon the common proverb, that the necromancers command the devil, which ye have already refuted. The one is grounded upon a received custom. We see that diverse Christian princes and magistrates, severe punishers of witches, will not only oversee magicians to live within their dominions, but even sometimes delight to see them prove some of their practices. The other reason is that Moses being brought up, as it is expressly said in the Scriptures, in all the sciences of the Egyptians, whereof no doubt, this was one of the principles. And he notwithstanding of this art, pleasing God as he did, consequentially that art professed by so godly a man could not be unlawful. Ape, as to the first of your reasons, grounded upon custom, I say an evil custom can never be accepted for a good law, for the great ignorance of the word in some princes and magistrates, and the contempt thereof in others, moves them to sin heavenly against their office in that point. As to the other reason, which seems to be of greater weight, if it were formed in a syllogism it behooved to be in many terms, and full of fallacies, to speak in terms of logic, for first, that the general proposition, affirming Moses to be taught in magic, I see no necessity. For we must understand that the Spirit of God there, speaking of sciences, understands them that are lawful, for except they be lawful, they are but abusive called sciences, and are but ignorances indeed. The picture is not the thing, nam homo pictus non est homo. Secondly, giving that he had been taught in it, there is greater difference between knowledge and practicing of a thing, as I said before. For God knows all things, being always good, and of our sin and our infirmity proceeds our ignorance. Thirdly, giving that he had both studied and practiced the same, which is more nor monstrous to be believed by any Christian, yet we know well enough that before that ever the Spirit of God began to call Moses, he was fled out of Egypt, being 40 years of age, for the slaughter of an Egyptian. And in his good father Jethro's land, first called at the fiery bush, having remained there other 40 years in exile. So suppose he had been the wickedest man in the world before, he then became a changed and regenerated man, and very little of old Moses remained in him. Abraham was an idolater in Ur of Chaldea, before he was called. And Paul, being called Saul, was a most sharp persecutor of the saints of God while that name was changed. Fie, what punishment then you think merits these magicians and necromancers? Api, the like no doubt, that sorcerers and witches merit, and rather so much greater, as their error proceeds of the greater knowledge, and so draws nearer to the sin against the Holy Ghost. And as I say of them, so say I the like of all such as consults, inquires, entertains, and oversees them which are seen by the miserable ends of many that ask counsel of them, for the devil hath never better tidings to tell to any than he told to Saul. Neither is it lawful to use so unlawful instruments, were it never for so good a purpose, for that axiom in theology is most certain and infallible, evil is never to be done, thus good may happen, nunquam faciendum est malum ut bonum indeveniat. AST 3. Demonology, Second Book Argument, the description of sorcery and witchcraft in special. Chapter 1. Proven by the Scripture that such a thing can be, and the reasons refuted of all such as would call it but imagination and melancholy humor. Fie, now since ye have satisfied me now so fully, concerning magic or necromancy, I will pray you to do the like in sorcery or witchcraft. Api, that field is likewise very large, and although in the mouths and pens of many, yet few know the truth thereof, so well as they believe themselves, as I shall so shortly as I can make you, God willing, as easily to perceive. Fie, but I pray you before ye go further, let me interrupt you here with a short digression, which is, that many can scarcely believe that there is such a thing as witchcraft, whose reasons I will shortly allege unto you, that ye may satisfy me as well in that, as ye have done with the rest. For first, whereas the Scripture seems to prove witchcraft to be, by diverse examples, and specially by sundry of the same, which ye have alleged. It is thought by some that these places speak of magicians and necromancers only, and not of witches. As in special, these wise men of Pharaoh's that counterfeited Moses's miracles were magicians they say, and not witches. As likewise that Pythia that Saul consulted with, and so was Simon Magus in the New Testament, as that very style imports. Secondly, where ye would oppose the daily practice and confession of so many that is thought likewise to be but very melancholy imaginations of simple raving creatures. Thirdly, if witches had such power of witching of folks to death, as they say they have, there had been none left alive long since in the world, but they, at the least, no good or godly person of whatsoever estate could have escaped their devilry. AP, your 3 reasons as I take are grounded, the first of them negative upon the Scripture, the second affirmative upon physic, and the third upon the certain proof of experience. As to your first, it is most true indeed that all these wise men of Pharaoh were magicians of art. As likewise, it appears well that the Pythia with whom Saul consulted was of that same profession, and so was Simon Magus. But ye omitted speak of the law of God, wherein are all magicians, divines, enchanters, sorcerers, witches, and whatsoever of that kind that consults with the devil, plainly prohibited and alike threatened against. And besides that, she who had the spirit of Pythia in the Acts, Act 16, whose spirit was put to silence by the apostle, could be no other thing, but a very sorcerer, or witch, if ye admit the vulgar distinction to be in a manner true, whereof I spoke in the beginning of our conference. For that spirit whereby she conquests such gain to her master was not of her raising, or commanding as she pleased to appoint, but spoke by her tongue, as well publicly as privately. Whereby she seemed to draw nearer to the fort of demoniacs, or possessed, if that conjunction betwixt them had not been of her own consent, as it appeared by her, not being tormented therewith, and by her conquesting of such gain to her masters, as I have already said. As to your second reason grounded upon physic, in attributing their concessions, or apprehensions to a natural melancholy humor, any that pleases medically to consider upon the natural humor of melancholy, according to all the physicians that ever write thereupon, they shall find that that will be over short a cloak to cover their knavery with. For as the humor of melancholy in the self is black, heavy, and terrene, so are the symptoms thereof in any persons that are subject thereunto, leanness, paleness, desire of solitude, and if they come to the highest degree thereof, mere folly and mania. Whereas by the contrary, a great number of them that ever have been convict, or confessors of witchcraft, as they may presently be seen by many that have at this time confessed, they are by the contrary, I say, some of them rich and worldly wise, some of them fat or corpulent in their bodies, and most part of them altogether given over to the pleasures of the flesh, continual haunting of company, and all kind of merriness, both lawful and unlawful, which are things directly contrary to the symptoms of melancholy, whereof I spoke. And further experience daily proves how loath they are to confess without torture, which witnesses their guiltiness, where by the contrary, the melancholies never spare to betray themselves by their continual discourses, feeding thereby their humor in that which they think no crime. As to your third reason, it scarcely merits an answer. For if the devil their master were not bridled, as the Scriptures teach us, suppose there were no men nor women to be his instruments, he could find ways enough without any help of others to wreck all mankind, whereunto he employs his whole study, and goes about like a roaring lion, as Peter said, I pet. 5. To that effect, but the limits of his power were set down before the foundations of the world were laid, which he hath not power in the least iota to transgress. But besides all this, there is over great a certainty to prove that they are by the daily experience of the harms that they do, both to men and whatsoever thing man possesses, whom God will permit them to be the instruments so to trouble or visit, as in my discourse of that art ye shall hear clearly proven. Chapter 2. The etymology and significance of that word of sorcery. The first entries and apprenticeships of they that give themselves to that craft. Fie, come on then I pray you, and return where ye left. AP, this word of sorcery is a Latin word, which is taken from casting of the lot, and therefore he that uses it is called sortiarius a sort. As to the word of witchcraft, it is nothing but a proper name given in our language. The cause wherefore they were called sorcieri proceeded of their practices seeming to come of lot or chance, such as the turning of the riddle, the knowing of the form of prayers, or such like tokens, if a person diseased would live or die. And in general, that name was given to them for using of such charms and fraits as that craft teaches them. Many points of their craft and practices are common betwixt the magicians and them, for they serve both one master, although in diverse fashions. And as I divided the necromancers into two sorts, learned and unlearned, so must I divide them in two other, rich and of better accounts, poor and of baser degree. These two degrees now of persons that practice this craft, answers to the passions in them, which, I told you before, the devil used as means to entice them to his service, for such of them are in great misery and poverty, he allures to follow him by promising unto them great riches and worldly commodity. Such as though rich, yet burns in a desperate desire of revenge, he allures them by promises to get their turn satisfied, and to their heart's contentment. It is noted now that old and crafty enemy of ours assails none though touched with any of these two extremities, except he first finds an entrant ready for him, either by the great ignorance of the person he deals with, joined with an evil life, or else by their carelessness and contempt of God. And finding them in an utter despair for one of these two former causes that I have spoken of, he prepares the way by feeding them craftily in their humor, and filling them further and further with despair while he finds the time proper to discover himself unto them. At which time, either upon their walking solitary in the fields, or else lying thoughtfully in their bed, but always without the company of any other, he either by voice, or in likeness of a man inquires of them what troubles them, and promises them a sudden and certain way of remedy upon condition on the other part, that they follow his advice, and do such things as he will require of them. Their minds being prepared beforehand, as I have already spoken, they easily agree unto that demand of his, and sin sets another twist where they may meet again. At which time, before he proceeds any further with them, he first persuades them to addict themselves to his service, which being easily obtained, he then discovers what he is unto them, makes them to renounce their God and baptism directly, and gives them his mark upon some secret place of their body, which remains sore, unhealed while his next meeting with them, and thereafter insensible, howsoever it be nipped or pricked by any, as it is daily proven to give them a proof thereby that as in doing, he could hurt and heal them. So all their ill and well-doing thereafter must depend on him. And besides that, the intolerable pain that they feel in that places where he hath marked them serves to waken them, and not to let them rest while their next meeting again, fearing lest otherwise they might either forget him, being his new apprentice and not well enough founded yet in that fiendish folly, or else remembering of that horrible promise they made him at their last meeting, they might shrink at the same, and press to call it back. At their third meeting he makes a show to be careful to perform his promises, either by teaching them ways how to get themselves revenged, if they be of that sort, or else by teaching them lessons, how by most vile and unlawful means they may obtain gain and worldly commodity, if they be of the other sort. Chapter 3. The witches' actions divided in two parts, the actions proper to their own persons, their actions towards others. The form of their conventions, and adoring of their master. Fie, ye have said now enough of their initiating in that order. It rests then that ye discourse upon their practices for once they be past apprentices, for I would gladly hear what is possible to them to perform indeed. Although they serve a common master with the necromancers, as I have before said, yet serve they him in another form. For as the means are diverse which allure them to the unlawful arts of serving the devil, so by diverse ways use they their practices, answering to these means which the devil used as instruments in them, though all ending to one end. To wit, the enlargement of Satan's tyranny, and crossing of the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, so far as to lie in the possibility, either of the one or other sort, or of the devil their master. For where the magicians, as allured by curiosity in the most part of their practices, seek principally the satisfying of the same, and to win to themselves a popular honor and estimation, these witches on the other part, being enticed either for the desire of revenge or of worldly riches, their whole practices are either to hurt men and their goods, or what they possess, for satisfying of their cruel minds in the former, or else by the wrath in whatsoever sort, of any whom God will permit them to have power of to satisfy their greedy desire in that last point. AP. In two parts their actions may be divided, the actions of their own person, and the actions proceeding from them towards any other. And this division being well understood, will easily resolve you what is possible to them to do. For although all that they confess is no lie upon their part, yet doubtlessly in my opinion, a part of it is not indeed, according as they take it to be. And in this I mean by the actions of their own person. For as I said before, speaking of magic, that the devil eludes the senses of these scholars of his, in many things, so say I the like of these witches. Fie, then I pray you, first to speak of that part of their own persons, and ever since ye may come next to their actions towards others. AP. To the effect that they may perform such services of their false master as he employs them in, the devil as God's ape, counterfeits in his servants this service and form of adoration that God prescribed, and made his servants to practice. For as the servants of God publicly use to convene for serving of him, so makes he them in great numbers to convene, though publicly they dare not, for his service. As none convenes to the adoration and worshipping of God, except they be marked with his seal, the sacrament of baptism, so none serves Satan and convenes to the adoring of him that are not marked with that mark whereof I already spoke. As the ministers sent by God teach plainly at the time of their public conventions how to serve him in spirit and truth, so that unclean spirit in his own person teaches his disciples, at the time of their convening, how to work all kinds of mischief, and craves control of all their horrible and detestable proceedings past for advancement of his service. Yea, that he may the more vilely counterfeit and scorn God, he oftentimes makes his slaves to convene in these very places, which are definite and ordained for the convening of the serving of God, I mean by churches. But this far, which I have yet said, I not only take it to be true in their opinions, but even so to be indeed. For the form that he used in counterfeiting God amongst the Gentiles makes me so to think, as God spoke by his oracles, speaks he not so by his? As God had as well bloody sacrifices, as others without blood, had he not the like? As God had churches sanctified to his service with altars, priests, sacrifices, ceremonies and prayers, had he not the like polluted to his service? As God gave responses by Urim and Thummim, gave he not his responses by the entrails of beasts, by the singing of fowls, and by their actions in the air? As God by visions, dreams, and ecstasies revealed what was to come, and what was his will under his servants, used he not the like means to forewarn his slaves of things to come? Yea, even as God loved cleanliness, hated vice and impunity, and appointed punishments therefore, used he not the like, though falsely I grant, but in eschewing the less inconvenient to draw them upon a greater, yet dissimulated he not, I say, so far as to appoint his priests to keep their bodies cleaned and undefiled before asking their responses of him. And feigned he not God to be a protector of every virtue, and just a revenger of the contrary? This reason then moves me that as he is that same devil, and as crafty now as he was then, so will he not spare as partially in these actions that I have spoken of, concerning the which persons. But further, witches oftentimes confess not only his convening in the church with them, but his occupying of the pulpit. Yea, their form of adoration to be the kissing of his hinder parts. Which though it seems ridiculous, yet may it likewise be true, seeing we read that in Calicut, he appearing in form of a goat buck, hath publicly that dishonest homage done unto him by every one of the people. So ambitious is he, and greedy of honor, which procured his fall, that he will even imitate God in that part, where it is said that Moses could see but the hinder parts of God for the brightness of his glory, Exo 33, and yet that speech is spoken, but alpha nu theta rho omega pi alpha theta epsilon iota alpha nu, anthropopathically. Chapter 4. What are the ways possible whereby the witches may transport themselves to places far distant? And what are impossible and mere illusions of Satan? And the reasons thereof. 5. But what ways say they or think ye it possible that they can come to these unlawful conventions? 8. There is the thing which I esteem their senses to be deluded in, and though they lie not in confessing of it, because they think it to be true, yet not to be so in substance or effect, for they say that by diverse means they may convene, either to the adoring of their master, or to the putting in practice any service of his, committed unto their charge. One way is natural, which is natural riding, going of sailing at what hour their master comes and advertises them. And this way may be easily believed. Another way is somewhat more strange, and yet it is possible to be true, which is being carried by the force of the Spirit, which is their conductor, either above the earth, or above the sea swiftly to the place where they are to meet. Which I am persuaded to be likewise possible in respect that as Habakkuk was carried by the angel in that form to the den where Daniel lay, Apocrypha of Bel, and the dragon, so think I the devil will be ready to imitate God, as well in that as in other things. Which is much more possible to him to do, being a spirit, than to a mighty wind, being but a natural meteor to transport from one place to another a solid body, as is commonly and daily seen in practice. But in this violent form they cannot be carried but a short bound, agreeing with the space that they may retain their breath, for if it were longer their breath could not remain unextinguished, their body being carried in such a violent and forcible manner. As the example, if one falls of a small height, his life is in peril according to the hard or soft lighting, but if one falls from a high and stay rock, his breath will be forcibly banished from the body before he can win to the earth, as is often seen by experience. And in this transporting they say themselves that they are invisible to any other, except amongst themselves, which may also be possible in my opinion. For if the devil may form what kind of impressions he pleases in the air, as I have said before, speaking of magic, why may he not far easier thicken and obscure so the air that is next about them by contracting it straight together, that the beams of any other man's eyes cannot pierce through the same to see them? But the third way of their coming to their conventions is that wherein I think them deluded, for some of them say that being transformed in the likeness of a little beast or fowl they will come and pierce through whatsoever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatsoever open the air may enter in at. And some say that their bodies lie still, as in ecstasy, their spirits will be ravished out of their bodies and carried to such places, and for verifying thereof, will give evident proof, as well by witnesses that have seen their body lying senseless in the meantime, as by naming persons whom with they met, and giving proof what purpose was amongst them, whom otherwise they could not have known. For this form of journeying they affirm to use them most, when they are transported from one country to another. Fie, surely I long to hear your own opinion of this, for they are like old wives' tales about the fire. The reasons that move me to think that these are mere illusions are these: first, for them that are transformed in likeness of beasts or fowls can enter through so narrow passages, although I may easily believe that the devil could, by his workmanship upon the air, make them appear to be in such forms, either to themselves or to others. Yet how he can contract a solid body within so little room, I think it is directly contrary to itself for it to be made so little, and yet not diminished, to be so straitly drawn together, and yet feel no pain. I think it is contrary to the quality of a natural body, and so like to the little transubstantiate God in the Papists' Mass that I can never believe it. So to have a quantity is so proper to a solid body, that as all philosophers conclude, it cannot be any more without one than a spirit can have one. For when Peter came out of the prison, Act 12, and the doors all locked, it was not by any contracting his body in so little room, but by the giving place of the door, though unespied by the gaolers. And yet there is no comparison, when this is done betwixt the power of God and of the devil. As to their form of ecstasy and spiritual transporting, it is certain the soul's going out of the body is the only definition of natural death. And who are once dead, God forbid we should think that it should lie in the power of all the devils in hell to restore them to life again, although he can put his own spirit in a dead body, which the necromancers commonly practice, as ye have heard. For that is the office properly belonging to God, and besides that, the soul once parted from the body cannot wander any longer in the world, but to the own resting place, where it must go immediately abiding the conjunction of the body again at the later day. And what Christ or the prophets did miraculously in this case, it cannot in no Christian man's opinion be made common with the devil. As for any tokens that they give for proving this, it is very possible to the devil's craft to persuade them to these means. For he being a spirit, may he not so ravish their thoughts and dull their senses, that their body lying as dead, he may object to their spirits as it were in a dream, and, as the poets write of Morpheus, represent such forms of persons, of places, and other circumstances as he pleases to elude them with? Yea, that he may deceive them with the greater efficacy, may he not in that same instant, by fellow angels of his, elude such other persons so in that same fashion, whom with he makes them to believe that they met, that all their reports and tokens, though severely examined, may every one agree with another. And that whatsoever actions, either in hurting men or beasts, or whatsoever other thing that they falsely imagine at that time to have done, may by himself or his marrows at that same time be done indeed. So as if they would give for a token of their being ravished at the death of such a person within so short space thereafter, whom they believe to have poisoned, or witched at that instant, might he not at that same hour have smitten that same person by the permission of God, to further deceiving of them, and to move others to believe them? And this is surely the likeliest way, and most according to reason, which my judgment can find out in this, and whatsoever other unnatural points of their confession. And by these means shall we fail surely, betwixt Charybdis and Scylla, in eschewing the not believing of them altogether on the one part, lest that draw us to the error that there is no witches, and on the other part in believing of it, make us to eschew the failing into innumerable absurdities, both monstrously against all theology divine and philosophy humane. Chapter 5. Which is actions towards others. Why there are more women of that craft than men. What things are possible to them to effectuate by the power of their master, the reasons thereof. What is the surest remedy of the harms done by them? Fie, forsooth your opinion in this seems to carry most reason with it, and since ye have ended, then the actions belonging properly to their own persons, say forward now to their actions used towards others. Api, in their actions used towards others, 3 things ought to be considered. First, the manner of their consulting thereupon. Next, their part as instruments. And last, their master's part, who puts them in the same execution. As to their consultations thereupon, they use them often in the churches where they convene for adoring, at what time their master inquiring at them what they would beat, every one of them proposes unto what wicked turn they would have done, either for obtaining of riches or for revenging them upon any whom they have malice at, who granting their demand, as no doubt willingly he will since it is to do evil, he teaches them the means whereby they may do the same. As for little trifling turns that women have ado with, he causes them to disjoint dead corpses, and make powders thereof, mixing such other things thereamongst as he gives unto them. 5. But before ye go further, permit me I pray you to interrupt you one word, which ye have put me in memory of by speaking of women. What can be the cause that there are 20 women given to that craft where there is one man? AP. The reason is easy, for as that sex is frilier than man is, so is it easier to be entrapped in these gross snares of the devil, as was over well proved to be true by the serpent's deceiving of Eve at the beginning, which makes him the homelier with that sex since. 5. Return now where ye left. AP. To some others at these times he teaches how to make pictures of wax or clay, that by the roasting thereof, the persons that they bear the name of may be continually melted or dried away by continual sickness. To some he gives such stones or boulders as will help to cure or cast on diseases. And to some he teaches kinds of uncouth poisons which mediciners understand not, for he is far more cunning than man in the knowledge of all the occult properties of nature. Not that any of these means which he teaches them, except the poisons which are composed of things natural, can of themselves help anything to these turns that they are employed, but only being God's ape, as well in that as in all other things. Even as God by his sacraments which are earthly of themselves work a heavenly effect, though no way by any cooperation in them. And as Christ by clay and spittle wrought together, opened the eyes of the blind man, John 9. Suppose there was no virtue in that which he outwardly applied, so the devil will have his outward means to be shows as it were of his doing, which hath no part of cooperation in his turns with him, how far that ever the ignorant be abused in the contrary. And as to the effects of these two farmer parts, to wit, the consultations, and the outward means, they are so wonderful as I dare not allege any of them without joining a sufficient reason of the possibility thereof. For leaving all the small trifles among wives, and to speak of the principal points of their craft. For the common trifles thereof, they can do without conversing well enough by themselves. These principal points I say are these, they can make men or women to love or hate other, which may be very possible to the devil to effectuate, seeing he being a subtle spirit, knows well enough how to persuade the corrupted affection of them whom God will permit him so to deal with. They can lay the sickness of one upon another, which likewise is very possible unto him, for since by God's permission, he laid sickness upon Job, why may he not far easier lay it upon any other? For as an old practitioner, he knows well enough what humor dominates most in any of us, and as a spirit he can subtly waken up the same, making it offending, or to abound, as he thinks meet for troubling of us, when God will so permit him. And for the taking off of it, no doubt he will be glad to relieve such of present pain, as he may think by these means to persuade to be caught in his everlasting snares and fetters. They can bewitch and take the life of men or women by roasting of the pictures, as I spoke of before, which likewise is very possible to their master to perform, for although, as I said before, that instrument of wax has not virtue in that turn doing, yet may he not very well even by that same measure that his conjured slaves melt that wax at the fire, may he not I say at these same times, subtly as a spirit so weaken and scatter the spirit of the life of the patient, as may make him on the one part for faintness to sweat out the humor of his body, and on the other part, not for the concurrence of these spirits which cause his digestion, so debilitate his stomach, that his humor radical continually sweating out on the one part, and no new good luck being put in the place thereof. For lack of digestion on the other, he at last shall vanish away, even as his picture will do at the fire. And that knavish and cunning workman, by troubling him only at some times, makes a proportion so near betwixt the working of the one and the other that both shall end as it were at one time. They can raise storms and tempests in the air, either upon sea or land, though not universally, but in such a particular place and prescribed bounds as God will permit them so to trouble. which likewise is very easy to be discerned from any other natural tempests that are meteorological, in respect of the sudden and violent raising thereof, together with the short enduring of the same. And this is likewise very possible to their master to do, he having such affinity with the air as being a spirit, and having such power of the forming and moving thereof, as ye have heard me already declare. For in the Scripture, that style of the prince of the air, Fs. 2, is given unto him. They can make folks to become frantic or manic, which is likewise very possible to do, since they are but natural sicknesses, and so he may lay on these kinds as well as any others. They can make spirits either to follow and trouble persons, or haunt certain houses, and scaring oftentimes the inhabitants, as hath been known to be done by our witches at this time. And likewise they can make some to be possessed with the spirits, and so to become very demonic, and this last sort is very possible likewise to the devil their master to do, since he may easily send his own angels to trouble in what form he pleases, any whom God will permit him so to use. But will God permit these wicked instruments by the power of the devil their master to trouble any of these means, any that believes in him? AP, no doubt, for there are 3 kinds of folk whom God will permit so to be tempted or troubled. The wicked, for their horrible sins, to punish them in the like measure. The godly that are sleeping in any great sins or infirmities and weaknesses in faith, to waken them up the faster by such an uncouth form, and even some of the best, that their patience may be tried before the world, as Job's was. For why may not God use any kind of extraordinary punishment, when it pleases him, as well as the ordinary roads of sickness, or other adversities? Who then may be free from these devilish practices? AP, no man ought to presume so far as to promise any impunity to himself, for God hath before all beginnings predetermined as well the particular sorts of plagues as of benefits for every man, which in the own time he ordains them to be visited with, and yet ought we not to be the more afraid for that, of anything that the devil, and his wicked instruments can do against us, for we fight daily against the devil in 100 other ways. And therefore as a valiant captain, fear no more being at the combat, nor stays from his purpose for the roaring shot of a cannon, nor the small clack of a pistolet, suppose he be not certain what may light upon him. Even so ought we boldly to go forward in fighting against the devil, without any greater terror, for these his rarest weapons, nor for the ordinary whereof we have the daily proof. Is it not lawful then by the help of some other witch to cure the disease that is cast on by that craft? AP, no ways lawful. For I gave you the reason thereof in that axiom of theology, which were the last words I spoke of magic. How then may these diseases be lawfully cured? AP, only by earnest prayer to God, by amendment of their lives, and by sharp perusing every one, according to this calling of these instruments of Satan, whose punishment to the death will be a salutary sacrifice for the patient. And this is not only the lawful way, but likewise the most sure, for by the devil's mean can never the devil be cast out, as Christ said, Mark 3. And when such a cure is used, it may well serve for a short time, but at the last, it will doubtlessly tend to the utter perdition of the patient, both in body and soul. Chapter 6. What sort of folks are less or most subject to receive harm by witchcraft? What power they have to harm the magistrate, and upon what respects they have any power in prison, and to what end may or will the devil appear to them therein? Upon what respects the devil appears in sundry shapes to sundry of them at any time. But who dare take upon him to punish them if no man can be sure to be free from their unnatural invasions? AP, we ought not the more of that restrain from virtue, that the way whereby we climb thereunto be straight and perilous. But besides that, as there is no kind of persons to subject to receive harm of them as these that are of sick and weak faith, which is the best buckler against such invasions, so have they so small power over none as over such as zealously and earnestly pursues them, without sparing for any worldly respect. Fie, then they are like the pest, which smites these sickest that flies it farthest and apprehend the deepest the peril thereof. Api, it is even so with them, for neither is able to them to use any false cure upon a patient, except the patient first believes in their power, and so hazard the tinsel of his own soul, nor yet can they have less power to hurt any, nor such as condemns most their doings. So being it come of faith, and not of any vain arrogance in themselves. Fie, but what is their power against the magistrate? Api, less or greater, according as he deals with them. For if he be slothful towards them, God is very able to make them instruments to waken and punish his sloth. But if he be the contrary, he according to the just law of God, and allowable law of all nations, will be diligent in examining and punishing them. God will not permit their master to trouble or hinder so good a work. Fie, but for they be once in the hand and secured, have they any further power in their craft? Api, that is according to the form of their detention. If they be but apprehended and detained by any private person, upon other private respects, their power no doubt either in escaping or in doing hurt is no less nor ever it was before. But if on the other part, their apprehending and detention be by the lawful magistrate, upon the just respects of their guiltiness in that craft, their power is then no greater than before that they ever meddled with their master. For where God begins justly to strike by his lawful lieutenants, it is not in the devil's power to defraud, or bereave him of the office, or affect his powerful and revenging scepter. Fie, but will never their master come to visit them, for they be once apprehended and put in hold? Api, that is according to the state that these miserable wretches are in. For if they be obstinate in still denying, he will not spare when he finds time to speak with them, either if he finds them in any comfort, to fill them more and more with the vain hope of some manner of relief, or else if he finds them in a deep despair. For if they be obstinate in still denying, he will not spare when he finds time to speak with them, either if he finds them in any comfort, to fill them more and more with the vain hope of some manner of relief, or else if he finds them in a deep despair. By all means to augment the same, and to persuade them by some extraordinary means to put themselves down, which very commonly they do. But if they be penitent and confess, God will not permit him to trouble them any more with his presence and allurements. Fie, it is not good using his counsel I see then, but I would earnestly know when he appears to them in prison, what forms uses he then to take? Api, diverse forms, even as he uses to do at other times unto them. For as I told you, speaking of magic, he appears to that kind of craftsmen ordinarily in a form according as they agree upon it amongst themselves, or if they be but apprentices, according to the quality of their circles or conjurations. Yet to these capped creatures he appears as he pleases, and as he finds fitting for their humors. For even at their public conventions he appears to diverse of them in diverse forms, as we have found by the difference of their confessions in that point. For he, deluding them with vain impressions in the air, makes himself to seem more terrible to the grosser sort, that they may thereby be moved to fear and reverence of him the more, and less monstrous and uncouth-like again to the craftier sort, lest otherwise they might stir and flinch at his ugliness. Fie, how then can he be felt as they confess they have done to him if his body be but of air? Api, I hear little of that amongst their confessions, yet may he make himself palpable either by assuming any dead body, and using the ministry thereof, or else by deluding as well their sense of feeling as seeing, which is not impossible to him to do since all our senses, as we are so weak, and even by ordinary sicknesses, will be oftentimes deluded. Fie, But I would ask one word further yet concerning his appearing to them in prison, which is this: may any other that chances to be present at that time in the prison see him as well as they? AP. Sometimes they will, and sometimes not, as it pleases God. Chapter 7. 2 forms of the devils visible conversing in the earth, with the reasons wherefore the one of them was commonest in the time of papistry, and the others since then. Those that deny the power of the devil deny the power of God, and are guilty of the error of the Sadducees. Hath the devil then the power to appear to any other, except to such as are his sworn disciples, especially since all oracles and such like kinds of illusions were taken away and abolished by the coming of Christ? AP. Although it be true indeed that the brightness of the gospel at his coming scaled the clouds of all these gross errors in the Gentilism, yet that these abusing spirits cease not since then at sometimes to appear, daily experience teaches us. Indeed, this difference is to be marked betwixt the forms of Satan's conversing visibly in the world. For of 2 different forms thereof, the one of them by the spreading of the evangel, and conquest of the white horse in the 6th chapter of the Revelation, is much hindered and become rarer thereof. This is appearing to any Christians, troubling of them outwardly, or possessing of them constrainedly. The other of them is become commoner and more used since then, I mean by their unlawful arts, whereupon our whole purpose hath been. This we find by experience in this thing to be true. For we no more ghosts and spirits were seen, nor tongue can tell in the time of blind papistry in these countries, where now by the contrary, a man shall scarcely all his time hear once of such things. And yet were these unlawful arts far rarer at that time, and never so much heard of nor so rife as they are now. What should be the cause of that? AP. The diverse nature of our sins procures at the justice of God, diverse sorts of punishments answering thereunto. And therefore, as is in the time of papistry, our fathers erring grossly, and through ignorance, that mist of errors overshadowed the devil to walk the more familiarly amongst them, and as it were by childishly and fearing of terrors to mock and accuse their childish errors. By the contrary, we now being sound of religion, and in our life rebelling to our profession, God justly by that sin of rebellion, as Samuel called it, accuses our life so wilfully fighting against our profession. Since ye are entered now to speak of the appearing of spirits, I would be glad to hear your opinion in that matter. For many deny that any such spirits can appear in these days as I have said. AP. Doubtlessly who denies the power of the devil would likewise deny the power of God, if they could for shame. For since the devil is the very contrary opposite to God, there can be no better way to know God than by the contrary, as by the one's power, though a creature, to admire the power of the great Creator, by the falsehood of the one to consider the truth of the other, by the injustice of the one to consider the justice of the other, and by the cruelty of the one to consider the mercifulness of the other, and so forth in all the rest of the essence of God, and qualities of the devil. But I fear indeed there be over many Sadducees in this world that deny all kinds of spirits. For convicting of whose error, there is cause enough if there were no more, that God should permit at sometimes spirits visibly to kith. Demonology, 3rd book argument, the description of all these kinds of spirits that trouble men or women, the conclusion of the whole dialogue. Chapter 1. The division of spirits in 4 principal kinds. The description of the first kind of them called spectra, and umbri mortuorum. What is the best way to be free of their trouble? Pray ye now then go forward in telling what ye think fabulous, or may be believed in that case. AP. That kind of the devil's conversing in the earth may be divided in 4 different kinds, whereby he scares and troubles the bodies of men, for the abusing of the soul I have spoken already. The first is where spirits trouble some houses or solitary places. The second, where spirits follow upon certain persons, and at diverse hours trouble them. The third, when they enter within them and possess them. The fourth is the kind of spirits that are called vulgarly the fairy. Of the three former kinds, ye heard already how they may artificially be made by witchcraft to trouble folk. Now it rests to speak of their natural coming as it were, and not raised by witchcraft. But generally I must forewarn you of one thing before I enter in this purpose, that is, that although in my discoursing of them, I divide them in diverse kinds, ye must notwithstanding there are of note my phrase of speaking in that. For doubtlessly they are in effect but all one kind of spirit, who for abusing the more of mankind, take on these sundry shapes, and use diverse forms of outward actions, as if some were of nature better than others. Now I return to my purpose. As to the first kind of these spirits that were called by the ancients by diverse names, according to as their actions were. For if they were spirits that haunted houses by appearing in diverse and horrible forms, and making great sound, they were called lemurs or spectra. If they appeared in likeness of any defunct to some friends of his, they were called umbra mortuorum. And so innumerable styles they got, according to their actions, as I have said already, as we see by experience how many styles they have given them in our language in the like manner. Of the appearing of these spirits, we are certified by the Scriptures, where the prophet Isaiah, Isa 13 and 34, threatening the destruction of Babylon and Edom, Isaiah 13, Jeremiah 50, declares that it shall not only be wrecked, but shall become so great a solitude, as it shall be the habitation of Aulets, and of Ziim and Iam, which are the proper Hebrew names for these spirits. The cause why they haunt solitary places, it is by reason that they may frighten, and shake the more the faith of such as them alone frequenting such places. For our nature is such, as in company we are not so soon moved to any such kind of fear, as being solitary, which the devil knowing well enough, he will not therefore assail us, but when we are weak. And besides that, God will not permit him so to dishonor the societies and companies of Christians, as in public times and places to walk visibly among them. On the other part, when he troubles certain houses that are dwelt in, it is a sure token either of gross ignorance, or of some gross and slanderous sins among the inhabitants thereof, which God by that extraordinary rod punishes. Philomaths, but by what way or passage can these spirits enter in these houses, seeing they allege that they will enter, door or window being shut? Epistemon, they will choose the passage for their entrance, according to the form that they are in at that time. For if they have assumed a dead body, whereinto they lodge themselves, they can easily enough open without din any door or window, and enter thereat. And if they enter as a spirit only, any place where the air may come in at is large enough an entry for them, for as I said before, a spirit can occupy no quantity. Philomaths, and will God then permit these wicked spirits to trouble the rest of a dead body, before the resurrection thereof? Or if he will so, I think it should be of the reprobate only. Epistemon, what more is the rest troubled of a dead body, when the devil carries it out of the grave to serve his turn for a space, than when the witches take it up and disjoint it, or when swine root up the graves? The rest of them that the Scripture speaks of, is not meant by a local remaining continually in one place, but by their resting from their travails and miseries of this world, until their latter conjunction again with the soul, at that time to receive full glory in both. And that the devil may use as well the ministry of the bodies of the faithful in these cases, as of the unfaithful, there is no inconvenience, for his hauntings with their bodies after they are dead can nowise defile them, in respect of the soul's absence. And for any dishonor it can be unto them, by what reason can it be greater than the hanging, beheading, or many such shameful deaths that good men will suffer? For there is nothing in the bodies of the faithful more worthy of honor, or freer from corruption by nature, than in these of the unfaithful, until the time they be purged and glorified in the latter day. as is daily seen by the vile diseases and corruptions that the bodies of the faithful are subject unto, as you will see clearly proved, when I speak of the possessed and demoniacs. Philomaths, yet there are some that affirm to have haunted such places, where these spirits are alleged to be, and could never hear nor see anything. Epistmen, I think well, for that is only reserved to the secret knowledge of God, whom he will permit to see such things and whom not. Philomaths, but where these spirits haunt and trouble any houses, what is the best way to banish them? Epistmen, by two means may only the remedy of such thing be procured. The one is ardent prayer to God, both of these persons that are troubled with them, and of that church whereof they are. The other is the purging of themselves by amendment of life from such sins, as have procured that extraordinary plague. Philomaths, and what means then these kinds of spirits, when they appear as the shade of a person newly dead, or to die, to his friends? Epistmen, when they appear upon that occasion, they are called wraiths in our language. Among the pagans the devil used that much, to make them believe that it was some good spirit that appeared to them then, either to forewarn them of the death of their friend, or else to discover unto them the will of the deceased, or what was the way of his slaughter. As is written in the book of the Histories Prodigious. And this way he easily deceived the pagans, because they knew not God. And to that same effect is it, that he now appears in that manner to some ignorant Christians. For he dare not so delude any that know that neither can the spirit of the deceased return to his friend, or yet an angel use such forms. Philomaths, and are not our werewolves one sort of these spirits also, that haunt and trouble some houses, or dwelling places? Epistmen, there has indeed been an old opinion of such like things, for by the Greeks they were called lycanthropoi, which signifies man-wolves. But to tell you simply my opinion in this, if any such thing has been, I take it to have proceeded, but of a natural superabundance of melancholy, which as we read, that it has made some think themselves pitchers, and some horses, and some one kind of beast or other. So suppose I that it has so vitiated the imagination and memory of some, as perusita inter alia it has so highly occupied them, that they have thought themselves very wolves indeed at times, and so have counterfeited their actions in going on their hands and feet, pressing to devour women and children, fighting and snatching with all the town dogs, and in using such like other brutish actions, and so to become beasts by a strong apprehension, as Nebuchadnezzar was 7 years, Daniel 4. But as to their having and hiding of their hard and shelly sloughs, I take that to be but learned by uncertain report, the author of all lies. Chapter 2. Argument. The description of the next two kinds of spirits, whereof the one follows outwardly, the other possesses inwardly, the persons that they trouble. That since all prophecies and visions are now ceased, all spirits that appear in these forms are evil. Philomaths, come forward now to the rest of these kinds of spirits. Epistmen, as to the next two kinds, that is, either these that outwardly trouble and follow some persons, or else inwardly possess them, I will conjoin them in one, because as well the causes are alike in the persons they are permitted to trouble, as also the ways whereby they may be remedied and cured. Philomaths, what kind of persons are they that are used to being so troubled? Epistmen, two kinds especially, either such as being guilty of grievous offenses, God punishes by that horrible kind of scourge, or else being persons of the best nature peradventure, that ye shall find in all the country about them, God permits them to be troubled in that sort, for the trial of their patience, and wakening up of their zeal, for admonishing of the beholders not to trust overmuch in themselves, since they are made of no better stuff, and peradventure blotted with no smaller sins, as Christ said, speaking of them upon whom the tower in Siloam fell, Luke 1:3, and for giving likewise to the spectators matter to praise God, that they meriting no better, are yet spared from being corrected in that fearful form. Philomaths, these are good reasons for the part of God, which apparently moves him so to permit the devil to trouble such persons. But since the devil has ever a contrary respect in all the actions that God employs him in, which is, I pray you, the end and mark he shoots at in this turn. Epistemon, it is to obtain one of two things thereby, if he may. The one is the tinsel of their life, by inducing them to such perilous places at such times as he either follows or possesses them, which may procure the same, and such like, so far as God will permit him, by tormenting them to weaken their bodies, and cast them into incurable diseases. The other thing that he wishes to obtain by troubling of them, is the tinsel of their soul, by enticing them to mistrust and blaspheme God, either for the intolerableness of their torments, as he essayed to have done with Job 1:0, or else for his promising unto them to leave the troubling of them, in case they would so do, as is known by experience at this same time by the confession of a young one that was so troubled. Philomaths, since you have spoken now of both these kinds of spirits, comprehending them in one, I must now go back again in casting some questions of every one of these kinds in particular. And first for these that follow certain persons, you know that there are two sorts of them, one sort that troubles and torments the persons that they haunt with, and another sort that are serviceable unto them in all kinds of their necessities, and omit never to forewarn them of any sudden peril that they are to be in. And so in this case, I would understand whether both these sorts be but wicked and damned spirits, or if the last sort be rather angels, as should appear by their actions, sent by God to assist such as he specially favors. For it is written in the Scriptures, that God sends legions of angels to guard and watch over his elect, Genesis 32, 1 Kings 6, Psalms 34. Epistemon, I know well enough wherefrom that error which you allege has proceeded, for it was the ignorant pagans that were the fountain thereof, who for that they knew not God, they forged in their own imaginations, every man to be still accompanied with two spirits, whereof they called the one genius bonus, the other genius malus. The Greeks called them endaimona and kakodaimona, whereof the former they said, persuaded him to all the good he did, the other enticed him to all the evil. But praised be God, we that are Christians, and walk not among the Sumerian conjectures of man, know well enough that it is the good Spirit of God only, who is the fountain of all goodness, that persuades us to the thinking or doing of any good, and that it is our corrupted flesh and Satan that entice us to the contrary. And yet the devil, for confirming in the heads of ignorant Christians that error first maintained among the pagans, he bides among the first kind of spirits that I speak of, appeared in time of papistry and blindness, and haunted divers houses, without doing any evil, but doing as it were necessary tasks up and down the house, and this spirit they called Brownie in our language, who appeared like a rough man, yea, some were so blinded, as to believe that their house was all the more prosperous, as they called it, that such spirits resorted there. Philomaths, but since the devil's intention in all his actions is ever to do evil, what evil was there in that form of doing, since their actions outwardly were good? Epistemon, was it not evil enough to deceive simple ignorance, in making them to take him for an angel of light, and so to account of God's enemy, as of their particular friend, where by the contrary, all we that are Christians ought assuredly to know that since the coming of Christ in the flesh, and establishing of his church by the apostles, all miracles, visions, prophecies, and appearances of angels or good spirits are ceased, which served only for the first sowing of faith, and planting of the church. Where now the church being established, and the white horse 5 whereof I spoke before, having made his conquest, the law and prophets are thought sufficient to serve us, or make us inexcusable, as Christ says in his parable of Lazarus and the rich man, Luke 1:6. Chapter 3. Argument. The description of a particular sort of that kind of following spirit, called incubi and succubi. And what is the reason wherefore these kinds of spirits haunt most the northern and barbarous parts of the world? Philomaths, the next question that I would speak is likewise concerning this first of these two kinds of spirits that you have conjoined, and it is this: you know how it is commonly written and reported, that among the rest of the sorts of spirits that follow certain persons, there is one more monstrous than all the rest, in respect as it is alleged they have intercourse naturally with them whom they trouble and haunt with? And therefore I would know in two things your opinion herein: first, if such a thing can be, and next, if it be, whether there be a difference of sexes among these spirits, or not. Epistemon, that abominable kind of the devil's abusing of men or women was called of old incubi and succubi, according to the difference of the sexes that they had congress with. By two means this great kind of abuse might possibly be performed. The one, when the devil only as a spirit, and stealing out the sperm of a dead body, abuses them that way, they not clearly seeing any shape, or feeling anything, but that which he so conveys in that part, as we read of a monastery of nuns, which were burnt for their being that way abused. The other means it when he borrows a dead body, and so visibly, and as it seems unto them naturally, as a man copulates with them. But it is to be noted, that in whatsoever way he uses it, that sperm seems intolerably cold to the person abused. For if he steals out the nature of a living person, it cannot be so quickly carried, but it will both lose the strength and heat by the way, which it could never have had for lack of agitation, which in the time of procreation is the procurer and wakener up of these two natural qualities. And if he occupying the dead body is his lodging, expel the same out thereof in the due time, it must likewise be cold by the participation with the qualities of the dead body whereout of it comes. And whereas you inquire if these spirits be divided in sexes or not, I think the rules of philosophy may easily resolve a man of the contrary, for it is a sure principle of that art, that nothing can be divided in sexes, except such living bodies as must have a natural seed to generate by. But we know spirits have no seed proper to themselves, nor yet can they engender one with another. Philomaths, how is it then that they say various monsters have been gotten by that way? Epistemon, these tales are nothing but a nils fabulae. For that they have no semen of their own, I have shown you already. And that the cold semen of a dead body can work nothing in generation, it is more than plain, as being already dead of itself as well as the rest of the body is, wanting the natural heat, and such other natural operations, as are necessary for working that effect. And in case such a thing were possible, which were all utterly against all rules of nature, it would breed no monster, but only such a natural offspring as would have come between that man or woman, and that other abused person, in case they both being alive had had to do with each other. For the devil's part therein is but the naked carrying, or expelling of that substance, and so it could not participate with no quality of the same. Indeed, it is possible to the craft of the devil to make a woman's belly to swell after he hath that way abused her, which he may do either by stirring up her own humor, or by herbs, as we see beggars daily do, and when the time of her delivery should come to make her labor with great anguish, like unto that natural course, and then subtly to slip into the midwife's hands sticks, stones, or some monstrous child brought from some other place. But this is more reported and guessed at by others, than believed by me. Philomaths, but what is the cause that this kind of abuse is thought to be most common in such wild parts of the world, as Lapland and Finland, or in our North Isles of Orkney and Shetland? Epistemon, because where the devil finds greatest ignorance and barbarity, there assails he most grossly, as I gave you the reason wherefore there were more witches of womankind than men. Philomaths, can any be so unhappy as to give their willing consent to the devil's vile abusing them in this form? Epistemon, yea, some of the witches have confessed that he has persuaded them to give their willing consent thereunto, that he may thereby have them tangled the deeper in his snares, but as the other compelled sort is to be pitied and prayed for, so is this most highly to be punished and detested. Philomaths, it is not the thing which we call the mare, which takes folks sleeping in their beds, a kind of these spirits, whereof you are speaking. Epistmen, no, that is but a natural sickness, which the mediciners have given that name of incubus unto, ab incubando, because it being a thick phlegm, falling into our breast upon the heart, while we are sleeping, intercedes so our vital spirits, and takes all power from us, as to make us think that there was some unnatural burden, or spirit lying upon us and holding us down. Chapter 4. Argument. The description of the demoniacs and possessed. By what reason the papists may have power to cure them. Philomaths, well, I have told you now all my doubts, and you have satisfied me therein, concerning the first of these two kinds of spirits that you have conjoined. Now I am to inquire only two things at you concerning the last kind, I mean the demoniacs. The first is, whereby shall these possessed folks be discerned from them, that are troubled with a natural frenzy, or mania? The next is, how can it be that they can be remedied by the Papists' Church, whom we count as heretics? It should appear that one devil should not cast out another, for then would his kingdom be divided in itself, as Christ said, Matthew 12, Mark 3. Epistmen, as to your first question, there are diverse symptoms whereby that heavy trouble may be discerned from a natural sickness, and specially three, omitting the diverse vain signs that the papists attribute unto it, such as the raging at holy water, their fleeing aback from the cross, their not abiding the hearing of God named, and innumerable such like vain things that were alike tiresome, and worthless to recite. But to come to these three symptoms then, whereof I spoke, I account the one of them to be the incredible strength of the possessed creature, which will far exceed the strength of 6 of the stoutest and strongest of any other men that are not so troubled. The next is the rising up so far of the patient's breast and belly, with such an unnatural stirring and vehement agitation with them, and such an iron hardness of his sinews so stiffly bended out, that it were not possible to prick out, as it were, the skin of any other person so far, so mightily works the devil in all the members and senses of his body. He being locally within the same, although of his soul and affections thereof, he has no more power than over any other man's. The last is the speaking of different languages, which the patient is known by them that were acquainted with him never to have learned, and that with an uncouth and hollow voice, and all the time of his speaking, a greater motion being in his breast than in his mouth. Point 2, but from this last symptom is excepted such as are altogether, in the time of their possessing, bereft of all their senses, being possessed with a dumb and blind spirit, whereof Christ relieved one, in the 12th chapter of Matthew. And as to your next demand, it is first to be doubted if the Papists, or any not professing the only true religion, can relieve any of that trouble. And next, in case they can, upon what respects it is possible unto them. As to the former, upon 2 reasons it is grounded. First, that it is known so many of them to be counterfeit, which deception the clergy invents for confirming of their rotten religion. The next is, that by experience we find that few who are possessed indeed are fully cured by them, but rather the devil is content to release the bodily hurting of them, for a short space, thereby to obtain the perpetual hurt of the souls of so many that by these false miracles may be induced or confirmed in the profession of that erroneous religion, even as I told you before that he does in the false cures, or casting off of diseases by witches. As to the other part of the argument, in case they can, which rather, with reverence of the learned thinking otherwise, I am induced to believe, by reason of the faithful report that men sound of religion have made according to their sight thereof, I think if so be. I say these may be the respects whereupon the Papists may have that power. Christ gave a commission and power to his apostles to cast out devils, which they accordingly thereunto put into execution. The rules he had them observe in that action were fasting and prayer, and the action itself was to be done in his name. This power of theirs proceeded not, then, of any virtue in them, but only in him who directed them. As was clearly proved by Judas, his having as great power in that commission as any of the rest. It is easy, then, to be understood that the casting out of devils is by the virtue of fasting and prayer, and invoking of the name of God, even though many imperfections be in the person that is the instrument. As Christ himself teaches us of the power that false prophets shall have to cast out devils, Matthew 7. It is no wonder, then, these respects of this action being considered, that it may be possible to the papists, though erring in various points of religion, to accomplish this, if they use the right form prescribed by Christ herein. For what the worse is that action, that they err in other things, more than their baptism is the worse that they err in the other sacrament, and have added many vain frights to the baptism itself. Philomaths, surely it is no little wonder that God should permit the bodies of any of the faithful to be so dishonored, as to be a dwelling place to that unclean spirit. Epistemon, there is it which I told right now, would prove and strengthen my argument of the devils entering in the dead bodies of the faithful. For if he is permitted to enter in their living bodies, even when they are joined with the soul, how much more will God permit him to enter in their dead carcasses, which is no more man, but the filthy and corruptible case of man. For as Christ says, it is not anything that enters within man that defile him, but only that which proceeds and comes out of him. Mark 7. Chapter 5. Argument. The description of the fourth kind of spirits called the fairies. What is possible therein, and what is but illusion? How far this dialogue entreats of all these things, and to what end? Philomaths, now I pray you, come on to that fourth kind of spirits. Epistemon, that fourth kind of spirits, which by the pagans was called Diana, and her wandering court, and among us was called the fairies, as I told you, or our good neighbors, was one of the sorts of illusions that was rifest in the time of papistry. For although it was held odious to prophesy by the devil, yet whom this kind of spirits carried away, and informed, they were thought to be luckiest and of best life. To speak of the many vain prattles founded upon that illusion, how there was a king and queen of fairy, of such a jolly court and train as they had, how they had a tithe and duty, as it were of all goods, how they naturally rode and went, ate and drank, and did all other actions like natural men and women, I think it more like Virgil's Campi Elysiae, than anything that ought to be believed by Christians, except in general, that as I spoke various times before, the devil deludes the senses of many simple creatures, in making them believe that they saw and heard such things as were nothing so indeed. Philomaths, but how can it be then, that many witches have gone to death with that confession, that they have been transported with the fairies to such a hill, which opening, they went in, and there saw a fairy queen, who being now lighter, gave them a stone 5 that had various virtues, which at different times has been produced in judgment. Epistemon, I say that, even as I said before of that imaginary ravishing of the spirit forth of the body. For may not the devil present to their fantasy, their senses being dulled, and as it were asleep, such hills and houses within them, such glistening courts and trains, and whatsoever such like wherewith he pleases to delude them? And in the meantime, their bodies being senseless, to convey into their hands any stone, or such like thing, which he makes them to imagine to have received in such a place. Philomaths, but what say you to their foretelling the death of various persons, whom they allege to have seen in these places? That is a sooth dream, as they say, since they see it walking. Epistemon, I think that either they have not been sharply enough examined, that gave so blunt a reason for their prophecy, or otherwise, I think it likewise is possible that the devil may prophesy to them when he deceives their imaginations in that sort. as well as when he plainly speaks unto them at other times, for their prophesying is but a kind of vision, as it were, wherein he commonly counterfeits God among the pagans, as I told you before. Philomaths, I would know now whether these kinds of spirits may only appear to witches, or if they may also appear to any other. Epistemon, they may do to both. To the innocent sort, either to affright them, or to seem to be a better sort of folk than unclean spirits are, and to the witches, to be a colour of safety for them, that ignorant magistrates may not punish them for it, as I told even now. But as the one sort, for being perforce troubled with them ought to be pitied, so ought the other sort, who may be discerned by their taking upon them to prophesy by them, that sort I say, ought as severely to be punished as any other witches, and rather the more, in that they go dissemblingly to work. Philomaths, and what makes the spirits have so different names from others? Epistemon, even the knavery of that same devil, who as he deludes the necromancers with innumerable feigned names for him and his angels, as in particular making Satan, Beelzebub, and Lucifer to be three different spirits, where we find the two former but different names given to the prince of all the rebelling angels by the Scripture. As by Christ, the prince of all the devils is called Beelzebub in that place which I alleged against the power of any heretics to cast out devils. By John in the Revelation, the old tempter is called Satan, the prince of all the evil angels. And last, to wit, Lucifer is but by allegory taken from the day star 7, so named in diverse places of the Scriptures, because of his excellence, I mean the prince of them, in his creation before his fall. Even so I say he deceives the witches by attributing to himself diverse names, as if every different shape that he transforms himself into were a different kind of spirit. Philomaths, but I have heard many more strange tales of these fairies than you have yet told me. Epistemon. As well I do in that, as I did in all the rest of my discourse. For because the ground of this conference of ours proceeded of your inquiring at me at our meeting, if there were such a thing as witches or spirits, and if they had any power, I therefore have framed my whole discourse only to prove that such things are and may be, by such number of examples as I show to be possible by reason, and keep myself from dipping any further in playing the part of a dictionary, to tell whatever I have read or heard in that purpose, which both would exceed faith, and rather would seem to teach such unlawful arts. Not to disallow and condemn them, as it is the duty of all Christians to do. Chapter 6. Argument of the trial and punishment of witches. What sort of accusation ought to be admitted against them? What is the cause of the increasing so far of their number in this age? Philomaths, then to make an end of our conference, since I see it draws late, what form of punishment think you merit these magicians and witches? For I see that you account them to be all alike guilty. Epistemon, they ought to be put to death according to the law of God, the civil and imperial law, and municipal law of all Christian nations. Philomaths, but what kind of death, I pray you? Epistemon, it is commonly used by fire, but that is an indifferent thing to be used in every country, according to the law or custom thereof. Philomaths, but ought no sex, age, nor rank to be exempted? Epistemon, none at all, being so used by the lawful magistrate, for it is the highest point of idolatry, wherein no exception is admitted by the law of God. Philomaths, then children may not be spared? Epistemon, yea, not a hair the less of my conclusion. For they are not that capable of reason as to practice such things. And for any being in company, and not revealing thereof, their less and ignorant age will no doubt excuse them. Philomaths, I see you condemn them all that are of the counsel of such crafts. Epistemon, no doubt, for as I said, speaking of magic, the consulters, trusters in, overlookers, entertainers, or stirrers up of these craftsfolk are equally guilty with themselves that are the practitioners. Philomaths, whether may the prince, then, or supreme magistrate, spare or overlook any that are guilty of that craft, upon some great respects known to him. Epistemon, the prince or magistrate for further trial's cause, may delay the punishing of them such a certain space as he thinks convenient, but in the end, to spare the life, and not to strike when God bids strike, and so severely punish in so odious a fault and treason against God. It is not only unlawful, but doubtless no less sin in that magistrate, than it was in Saul's sparing of Agag, 1 Samuel 1:5. And so comparable to the sin of witchcraft itself, as Samuel alleged at that time. Philomaths, surely then, I think since this ought to be so severely punished, judges ought to beware to condemn any, but such as they are sure are guilty, neither should the clattering report of an accused old woman serve in so weighty a case. Epistemon, judges ought indeed to beware whom they condemn, for it is as great a crime, as Solomon says, to condemn the innocent, as to let the guilty escape free, Proverbs 1:7. Neither ought the report of any one infamous person be admitted for a sufficient proof, which can stand of no law. Philomaths, and what may a number then of guilty persons' confessions work against one that is accused? Epistemon, the assize must serve for interpreter of our law in that respect. But in my opinion, since in a matter of treason against the prince, children or wives or never so defamed persons may of our law serve for sufficient witnesses and proofs, I think surely that by a far greater reason, such witnesses may be sufficient in matters of high treason against God. For who but witches can be proofs, and so witnesses, of the doings of witches? Philomaths, indeed, I trust they will be loath to prosecute any honest man upon their counsel. But what if they accuse folk to have been present at their imaginary conventions in the spirit, when their bodies lie senseless, as you have said? Epistemon, I think they are not a hair the less guilty, for the devil dared never have borrowed their shade or likeness to that turn, if their consent had not been at it, and the consent in these turns is death under the law. Philomaths, then Samuel was a witch, for the devil resembled his shape, and played his person, in giving response to Saul. Epistemon, Samuel was dead as well before that, and so none could slander him with meddling in that unlawful art. For the cause why, as I take it, that God will not permit Satan to use the shapes or similitudes of any innocent person at such unlawful times, is that God will not permit that any innocent person shall be slandered with that vile defection. For then the devil would find ways anew to calumniate the best. And this we have in proof by them that are carried with the fairies, who never see the shades of any in that court, but of them that thereafter are tried for having been brethren and sisters of that craft. And this was likewise proved by the confession of a young lass, troubled with spirits, laid on her by witchcraft. That although she saw the shapes of diverse men and women troubling her, and named the persons whom these shades represented, yet never one of them was found to be innocent, but all clearly tried to be most guilty, and the most part of them confessed the same. And besides that, I think it has been seldom heard tell of, that any whom persons guilty of that crime accused, as having known them to be their companions by eyesight, and not by hearsay, but such as were so accused of witchcraft could not be clearly tried upon them, were at the least publicly known to be of a very evil life and reputation, so jealous is God, I say, of the fame of them that are innocent in such causes. And besides that, there are two other good helps that may be used for their trial. The one is the finding of their mark, and the trying of the insensibleness thereof. The other is their floating on the water, for as in a secret murder, if the dead carcass be at any time thereafter handled by the murderer, it will gush out of blood, as if the blood were crying to the heaven for revenge of the murderer, God having appointed that secret supernatural sign for trial of that secret unnatural crime. So it appears that God has appointed, for a supernatural sign of the monstrous impiety of the witches, that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom, that have shaken off them the sacred water of baptism, and wilfully refused the benefit thereof. No, not so much as their eyes are able to shed tears, threaten and torture them as you please, before first they repent, God not permitting them to dissemble their obstinacy in so horrible a crime, albeit the womenkind especially be able otherwise to shed tears at every light occasion when they will, yea, although it were dissemblingly, like the crocodiles. Philomaths, well, we have made this conference to last as long as leisure would permit. And to conclude then, since I am to take my leave of you, I pray God to purge this country of these devilish practices, for they were never so rife in these parts as they are now. Epistmen, I pray God that so be too. But the causes are over manifest, that makes them to be so rife. For the great wickedness of the people on the one part, procures this horrible defection, whereby God justly punishes sin, by a greater iniquity, and on the other part, the consummation of the world, and our deliverance drawing near, makes Satan to rage the more in his instruments. Knowing his kingdom to be so near an end, Revelation 2. And so, farewell for this time. The end.